Once almost completely erased from the American landscape, bison are now caught in a new battle. These ancient grazers were once a symbol of untamed freedom and natural abundance across the Great Plains. Tens of millions of bison once roamed North America, shaping ecosystems and sustaining indigenous cultures for centuries. Their numbers collapsed due to overhunting, land seizure, rail expansion, and a coordinated campaign of extermination. By the late 1800s, only a few hundred remained, clinging to survival in remote strongholds. But through conservation efforts and tribal leadership, the bison has slowly made a historic, if fragile, comeback. Yet that comeback has sparked fierce debate, not over biology, but over politics, identity, and land control. Across the West, bison are challenging how Americans define wilderness, stewardship, private property, and public responsibility. Federal and tribal agencies have worked for decades to reintroduce bison to their former native ranges. But the moment these animals cross invisible boundaries, they become a flashpoint in an ongoing cultural struggle. Landowners argue that bison should remain fenced, managed, and kept away from private property at all costs. The fear is not just about fences being knocked down, but about diseases spreading to livestock herds. Brucellosis, a disease that causes miscarriages in cattle, is often cited as the primary concern. Although wild bison have never conclusively passed brucellosis to domestic cattle, the fear remains deeply rooted. Ranchers also worry about grazing competition, land damage, and the threat of uncontrolled population growth. From their perspective, wild bison symbolize chaos in an industry that demands precision, control, and stability. Meanwhile, Native American tribes view the bison as far more than an ecological restoration project. For many tribes, bison are relatives, beings with whom they share history, spirit, and mutual survival. Their return represents a cultural renewal and a long overdue correction to the injustices of colonization. Tribal nations have led the charge to bring bison back to ancestral lands, often using their own resources. This movement isn't only about food sovereignty, but about restoring dignity, connection, and traditional ecological knowledge. However, some states have resisted these efforts, treating bison as either livestock or invasive nuisances. Montana has passed legislation restricting the movement and classification of wild bison across county lines. Wyoming and South Dakota have also enforced strict limitations, citing disease risk and economic disruption. Even where bison are welcomed, conflicts flare over fencing, road crossings, and damage to neighboring lands. The issue escalates each winter when Yellowstone bison leave the park in search of food and space. Once they cross park boundaries, they lose their protected status and are often subjected to lethal control. Hazing operations use helicopters, snowmobiles, and ATVs to drive bison back into Yellowstone's artificial borders. When that fails, bison are captured, quarantined, or even slaughtered to appease livestock industry stakeholders. These practices have drawn sharp criticism from environmental groups and indigenous advocates across the country. They argue that managing a wild species like livestock ignores its ecological and cultural significance. At the same time, state wildlife agencies face immense pressure from ranching interests and political leaders. Caught in the middle, they struggle to balance conservation mandates with local economic and political realities. Adding to the complexity is the role of private landowners who voluntarily host bison for conservation. These landowners see value in bison tourism, ecosystem restoration, and cultural partnerships with indigenous tribes. But even private initiatives have triggered legal and logistical challenges related to fencing, liability, and classification. Bison are still not uniformly treated as wildlife across states, making regulation a patchwork of contradictions. In some places, they require brand inspections, permits, or fencing equivalent to that for dangerous livestock. These inconsistencies reflect a deeper tension over how land and animals are valued in modern America. Public lands, once considered open range for cattle, are now being reconsidered for ecological restoration. Bison, as a keystone species, can help regenerate prairies, store carbon, and support diverse wildlife. Their wallowing behavior creates micro-habitats that benefit birds, insects, and native grasses across vast plains. They are living agents of ecosystem healing, but their presence challenges long-held notions of land productivity. To ranchers, every acre used for bison might mean less forage for their herds or income. To tribal nations, every acre returned to bison is a step toward justice, healing, and self-determination. This stark contrast has made compromise difficult and inflamed broader debates over Western land policy. Federal legislation has been introduced to support bison restoration and clarify their legal status as wildlife. Yet such efforts often stall in Congress amid lobbying from agriculture groups and states fearing federal overreach. The political gridlock mirrors long-standing divisions over climate policy, conservation funding, and indigenous sovereignty. In this environment, the bison has become a symbol for more than just wildness. It now represents resistance. Resistance to industrial land use, to top-down politics, and to erasure of indigenous voices in decision-making. Tribal coalitions like the Buffalo Nation's Grasslands Restoration Project are building new conservation models from the ground up. These models prioritize indigenous science, community-led planning, and ecosystem-based approaches to wildlife management. Some tribes are collaborating with universities and non-profits to track bison behavior, genetics, and environmental impact. Their findings are reshaping how we think about rewilding, not as nostalgia, but as future building. Still, for every success story, there are battles being fought in courtrooms, state houses, and rural town halls. Bison restoration plans are regularly blocked by lawsuits, funding restrictions, and opposition from local elected officials. Social media campaigns have intensified the debate, spreading misinformation and amplifying rural-urban cultural divides. To many Americans, the return of bison evokes pride, reverence, and environmental progress. To others, it feels like an unwanted disruption imposed by outsiders who don't understand ranch life. This emotional divide makes compromise harder, even when solutions are technically feasible and mutually beneficial. Pilot programs that compensate ranchers for bison damage or allow managed migration have shown promising results. Collaborative grazing plans have even demonstrated that cattle and bison can share land under rotational systems. But without political support, these models remain exceptions rather than widespread alternatives to conflict. As climate pressures increase, restoring resilient species like bison may prove critical to ecosystem stability. Bison can endure harsh winters, bounce back from droughts, and thrive in landscapes increasingly threatened by change. They offer one of the best chances to bring biodiversity and carbon balance back to degraded prairies. Yet they remain boxed in by barbed wire, bureaucracy, and political infighting over land, law, and legacy. The question is no longer whether bison can return, it's whether we are ready to let them. That readiness depends on more than science. It depends on courage, cultural humility, and cross-sector collaboration. Bison force us to confront uncomfortable truths about American expansion, resource extraction, and ecological displacement. They ask us to reimagine landscapes not as commodities, but as interconnected systems of life and meaning. As the West continues to change, the bison stands as a mirror to our values and priorities. What we choose to protect and what we continue to resist will shape this region for generations to come. In the end, the battle over bison is not just a wildlife story, but a test of democracy. Who gets to decide what thrives, what vanishes, and what is restored in the American West? The bison may be wild, but the choices surrounding them are deeply human, political, and moral.